So if we were being really intentional in our communication, we would have said, hey, Deb, could you sit over there with Earle? And then,
you want to desegregate this?
And yeah.
we were talking about it.
But
You want.
But the way the Spirit works, is that what we have is a structure of the conversation that Jim called for. So before we transition to talk about our context, right, and we invite Dr. Krause and Reverend Michelle to guide us into that conversation based on their reflections and responses. I want to center in on where we are and invite you to center in on where you are. You've heard things that you've had reactions and responses to. I want to invite you to just take a minute, actually a few seconds. I ain't going to give you a full minute. Ask yourself the question, what have I heard that gives me pause, creates in me tension? Dr. Fisher said we might need more tension, more dissonance, or created dissonance. Reflect on what made you uncomfortable. And then St. Louis, what did you hear that made you want something different here? And what is it that you wanted that was different? This dude came in from D.C., this other dude came up from Memphis on a knee stroller. It made you think about what you experience every day. What did they make you think and feel? As we transition, we have this conversation at an intersection. We honored earlier with appreciation faith leaders who are here. We also have some elected and appointed leaders who are here. Invite elected officials who are here, willing to sit in on a conversation about faith, even one about Jesus. If you would just at least stand, wave, let folks know that you exist. We're grateful. We know one of our alderwomen was here earlier. She perhaps had to leave, but we're appreciative of that. So now I want to invite Dr. Krause, Reverend Higgins, who sit at the intersection of these voices of faith and these people in St. Louis, to share your own reactions and reflections, what you might share from this as we seek a conversation with everyone in the room. I'm going to sit down. Sorry.
Well, thank you is the first thing I want to say. Thank you for setting a framework and telling the truth. And as a biblical scholar, I just want to start by saying, Jim noted the claim, the scriptural claim, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But the scriptures, and I think I heard it yelled out over here, also talk about other gospels. And I want that to give us a sense of courage that this is a very old conversation. This is a very old struggle about whose image are we made in, what is the meaning of salvation, how is it that Jesus saves us. It's an old, old conversation. And as I've been thinking about how the book Christ in Crisis frames the conversation, I was reminded of a great text in my bibliography of my development as a theologian and biblical scholar from the late 80s. Womanist scholar Jacqueline Grant wrote the path-breaking, trailblazing Christology of womanist theology. White women's Christ, black women's Jesus. And the framework in which Jacqueline Grant names in the context of black theology, something that really hadn't been named by theologians, and she takes on James Cone and everyone in that, is the phenomenon that that black women's religion in Christian theology claims Jesus as a co-sufferer and a friend rather than a transcendent savior. And that, I think, is a really powerful kind of naming of the dynamics in the conversation we're imagining and in the politics of where we are now. And so when we think about what was the phrase? A people-centered policy making, which is the mission of the Deaconess Foundation, or a stated goal of this 2020 focus that you all are naming. I think of Jesus in a womanist theological framing as engaged in a people-centered kingdom building, you know, and following Jesus in that work in the Gospels is the work of being with him on the way, which can also be translated, I think, more effectively, in the street. Being with him in the street, as we do, as you shared, Earle, move from the symbolic to the structural. Jesus was engaged in the structural work of how systems were demeaning and destroying God's people. Fueled by a theological imagination, empowered by a reading of Isaiah and the prophets that understood God's saving work in the world as a redemptive work, a repairing work of that which is broken. I often say to my students, the gospel doesn't come into the world because it's all right. It comes in the world because it's broken and people are suffering. God's people are suffering. And so Jesus' vision is powered by Isaiah's vision of this understanding of joining God in that redemptive work, co-sufferer, a co-journer along the way, in the street, being with the people. And the division of the gospel, and I'm thinking here of the Gospel of Mark, of Jesus engaging on the one hand in his ministry in Galilee, and on the other hand, his ministry to and within Jerusalem. And Jim, you named it, that when Jesus goes into the city, that is why they killed him. He goes into the city and he holds the structure there accountable. And he calls out, and all of the economics of the structure are threatened by his work there and named in that theological framing, that prophetic framing of Jesus' action in the temple. But before he does that in Galilee, he engages another very important structure. He doesn't go into the city, he goes into the village, he goes into the town. And when he goes into the villages and towns, he challenges the household. He challenges the family. He challenges, and in Greek, which the Gospels are written in Greek, the term family and household are the same word family, oikos. That's right. And if you read those opening chapters of the Gospel of Mark, you will see Jesus interrogating and tearing apart the structure of the family as a domination machine. Why are all these people so hungry and sick? Why are they all so broken down and suffering? This system isn't working. And when I think about families and households in our context, in our history, in our legacy, it brings me right to Buck Jones and the history of housing and housing discrimination and redlining and wealth accumulation and racial disparities in our country. And I think that if we're following Jesus, interrogating that structure, having a conversation about that work and about co-suffering with those who suffer and understanding ourselves in that work to be joining Jesus in the redemptive work of God in the world, I think we're on to something. And I think we might be in a conversation that could actually change some things. Thank you.
The doors of the center are open.
Yeah.
Pass that plate, y'all. Saints and friends, I am so moved by the expertise, the presence, the power of this panel. I am humbled to be here and always grateful to share what I'm learning more than what I know. And what I'm learning is, as much as I need to know, to hold on to remember that knowing the truth sets us free. The words of Jesus, my sustenance and Savior, I need to hold on to as well and remember and embody the words of my spirit mentor, the living, ever becoming greater, ancestral being Dr. Angela Davis, who said, freedom is a constant struggle. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And freedom is a constant struggle. Let it always be a refrain. Oh, America, you must be born again. And the trauma with which you entered this world through, you could watch videos about how you probably got here. That was a struggle. Somebody labored to give you life. Someone had pain to move you from the womb outside on your way to glory. And so I have found more and more as I learn, as I struggle, as I'm free and continue to struggle for it, I have learned that the presence of the image of God all around me teaches me exactly about who God is. And so when we decide that God is like us instead of us like them, I'm Trinitarian, so God is three people. Let's talk about polytheism sometime. God is like us instead of us like them, then we forget something that I believe we have to learn. In order for me to work with the movements that I cling to, that I love, movements full of people who do not share my faith, I have to learn one simple thing, and I'm talking to the Christians just real fast. I have to learn one simple thing in order to work with these people and love them. God doesn't need worship. I've learned this, I guess, rather recently when I've looked at evangelicals and realized they don't want to help or support people who won't bow down before their graven image that they've named Jesus the Christ. They don't want to work with people that won't either support or pour money into or at least act like everything in life is about Jesus. If everything in your life is about Jesus, then the first thing you need to know about Jesus is that he didn't show up on earth craving, needing worship. Who is this needy God? Your God is that insecure? Dr. Reverend Tracy Blackman told me a couple years ago, is God so fragile that he has to use the word heresy every time somebody says something? Who is your needy God? And so I can't work with communists. I can't work with Marxists because they won't worship a God that don't need damn one of us to kiss his toes or her toes or theirs. The first thing you need to know about this God you serve is that spirit is inside of you. And it don't need worship. And so I will end with that. Because I want us to remember that as we choose this moral discussion, discussing, and bringing Jesus into conversations and spaces where people are either utterly disappointed with the followers that he has to survive, or people are deeply convinced that he looks nothing like the radicals that he lives with right now. Jesus lives with people who are not giving him the praise that he doesn't need. So you want to find the Christ? Holla at me. It's a whole bunch of people that don't call on his name, and he prefers them because y'all are too needy.
So I'm just looking out for all the people who are Googling now one.
Yeah.
It's one word, now one. Wow. Dr. Gardner-Taylor said, until he heard a woman preach, he didn't realize he had only heard half the gospel. I want to invite, I'm grateful for the team that makes all this work possible as we enter into a conversation together. I invite the Deaconess Foundation staff team, Reverend Aaron Rogers, Matthew Oldani, Keisha Davis, Constance Rush, David Merritt Flores, and somewhere hanging around here, Cassell Williams, making sure that the building is spotless and hospitable to you, and Michael Schultz, who we named earlier, who is sitting here to help us out by just sharing a little bit. I'm going to invite you up again in a minute. So Reverend Aaron is looking for folks who are willing to share their desires for faith-inspired social action in St. Louis. Things that you felt some dissonance or tension about that you want to see manifest in your own neighborhood, your own community here in St. Louis. What do we want out of this community? Senator Carla May.
You know, when you said radical and controversial, you know, I try not to live up to my title, but I do. So when we're talking about this discussion, it just brings a lot of things to front. First, the faith part of it. I'm gonna ask a question, but then I want to give you some foundation to the question, and then I'll get back to it. So in 1995, I was a young lady called to ministry by God, and I remember having the sleepless nights, saying, "I'm not doing this. I can't walk up there, you know, in the pulpit," because in the Baptist church that I was raised in, they didn't believe in women ministers. And so I was in my 20s, I was young, and I kept saying, okay. But the stirring, the sleepless nights, it wouldn't leave me alone. My pastor at that time was ill, and he was in a nursing home, and I would go see him. And he would just speak to me because he knew what was happening, and I would just sit in a chair next to his bed. And he wouldn't even get out of bed, and he would just start to talk to me, which would help resolve some of the issues I was struggling with. So I accepted that calling when a new pastor took over the church. But I accepted the calling because God showed me this word pulpit in the Bible. It only shows up one time, and it's when Nehemiah had to build a pulpit because the crowd was so big, he had to speak to the crowd. It had no meaning. The church had made the pulpit a god within the church. So when God showed me that, I accepted the call that God had on my life at that time. Since then, they was willing to license me, but because when I was going through the ministerial classes or whatever, they didn't want to ordain me. But then God spoke again. He said, I don't need them to ordain you. It was in the Bible. You know, I have already called and ordained you. So I accepted the license, and then I just moved out the Baptist church to a word church. And I've been ministering in what I call James's gospel, the scattered sheep around the world. So my question is this for me, the struggle that I have now in the position that I'm in is how do I get to the truth that will set you free if white America is not willing to tell the truth? See, the struggle that I see is that just like right now, the fight that I'm having in the state legislature is you have African-American history as an elective, and then you have American history as a requirement. Like African-American history and American history is not one and the same. And then you don't want to tell the truth to white American white children about what white America did and how they got here and stole land and came to, you know, they're not really Americans either. We all from somewhere else. So if I can't get that truth told, because, you know, I've been writing this book called Writing, R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, Writing History, the Untold Story of America. One day you'll read it when I'm finished. But if I can't get that story told, that truth pressed to the ground, rising again, how can I talk about Jesus in the right context? And how can I, you know, understand that I know it takes all of us together If we can't tell that truth, that the scientists told a long time ago that Adam and Eve was black, because you can't get melanin from non-melanin. If we don't get that truth, then where do we start with Jesus and reclaiming him? That's my question.
On two levels, I want to invite Jim to respond to this question in two senses. This is, so the question on its face is about how we care for our children, and a legislative issue about how we frame one of two systems we've ever created for kids in America, the K-12 education system and the juvenile justice system. One is the K-12 education system. And we have a black woman who's a Democratic state senator raising a question and carrying this campaign. I've heard you talk about the most committed core of the Democratic Party, who it is and what they want versus what the Democratic Party is talking about nationally. That's a black woman of faith who's a state senator, who happens to be a Democrat, raising this concern. How do you think we react and respond to that with that context, her core question, but then also the context that you framed before?
There was a lot in that question. When's the book coming out? You know, it's interesting. This kind of relates to it quickly. At these book events, they're often sponsored in towns by an independent bookstore. You know, that's what town meetings, these bookstores are really town meetings, one of the few places left. And even if they held it in a church auditorium, a lot of people there are not necessarily religious who come. So I often start by saying, you've already heard a lot of religious words, Christ and crisis and reclaiming Jesus and spiritual advisor and all this stuff. And I know that brings up experiences that people in this crowd have with religious language and institutions. And that experience is disappointing or hurtful or even feeling like betrayal or assault. I would say we don't have enough time tonight to talk all that through, but let's take a moment of quiet and silence to recognize and respect those feelings. We literally have a moment of silence where people, because of all they've heard that is allegedly religious, that has hurt and abused them in their experience. And then we start saying, okay, I don't think the answer to bad religion is no religion. But it's better religion, more important, maybe true faith, you know? Yeah. So how do we have a fresh new conversation about even language that has hurt us and betrayed us? So the kids thing, I mean, it's like, if you want to test for politics, I mean, most people want a lot of the same stuff for their kids, but they're not talking about their hopes and dreams for their kids, fears, hopes. They're not doing it across racial lines. As a Little League baseball coach, when moms talk about their hopes and fears for their kids, it's bonding. Why do you think our geography is so deliberately racialized? It's not accidental. I mean, you explained to me once, after Ferguson, the geography of St. Louis. It's to keep us from having those conversations. That's what it's intended, because those conversations are dangerous. If you talk about what we want for our kids. And that's always the test of politics, really, is what, you know, how many years did you teach those kids? And you did too, for so long, right? That's what it comes down to. And we are so separated from, like, on my Little League baseball teams, all of the black parents of all my black players, all of them, have had the talk about how to behave in the presence of a police officer. Washington, D.C., even most of the white, liberal, progressive parents don't know what's going on, don't know what their kids' teammates are hearing from their parents. So we have that talk among the kids, and the kids get the white kids get really angry when they hear about what their teammates hear from their parents. And the parents say, but you're gonna make them upset. I said, yes, that's the intention. And I heard a lot of this dissonance. And so how do we be, and they do get upset.
Yeah.
This is your teammates, if you're an athlete, your kid, are your best friends.
Yeah.
And when they hear this is going on. So how do we have, what are the venues for this conversation about how our kids are being treated? Just one quick story. I remember one time in the DC, it used to be civil disobedience in the old days. Used to be they actually put you in jail. Now they just pay a fine and you go home, and these white protesters, they pay a fine and they go home and they tell everyone they just did civil disobedience. They used to put you in jail, and even general population for a while. And I remember one time I was in the DC jail, always overcrowded. It was a half basketball court, which was now a dorm. 60 guys, bunk beds, one bathroom. And the kid across from me in my bunk, he looked about 15. And I guess he had to be 18, I guess, but he didn't look that. And he was in jail for a bus transfer violation. Wow. That's when somebody they just pass out transfers, take transfer on the bus, and the kids run and say, transfer, transfer.
Yeah.
And the adult hands out a transfer if they don't need it, and the kid gets on the bus. Police are in the bushes, waiting for a kid to do a bus transfer violation. He gets put into jail for 3 months until his hearing. Public defender, that title is often interesting, comes once, and the kid lost his card and never even got out to call his grandparents, who he's living with, who don't know where he is. That kid in that room for 3 months is going to come out a whole different person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I got out, after my few days there, I called his grandparents and we got him out and all that. But, how many parents would accept that happening to a kid if they knew what was going on? If they had any relationship with anybody who's got, so how do we deal with this geography, which is racialized by policy to keep us from knowing what's happening to each other's kids?
Yeah.
That's why they do it.
So one of the things I hear Senator May saying she wants is the transformation of educational policy, right? Curriculum. What else do you want? What do you want to see faith leaders, faith communities working on here in St. Louis? Reverend Caldwell.
Well, I want to say two things. One of the things that I'd like to see happen in St. Louis, this is my home. I live in Las Vegas now. We don't get this in Las Vegas, Dr. Wilson, so thank you. I'd like to see the village raise the children again. One of the things that I heard an over-streaming theme throughout the presentation was that there is an identity crisis in the faith community. And the first thing I did, I thought about the scripture in Genesis 1:27. I am created in the image of God. And so for me now, after being in ministry for 31 years, that image is black, brown, yellow, female and male. But when I was a kid, it was the white Jesus that hung on the walls of many houses in St. Louis. So in saying that, I am reminded of what my image of God is, but also of the Eskimo's image, because that's an Eskimo Jesus. And for the Asian, that's an Asian Jesus, that image is going to be. And for the white supremacist, it is a white supremacist Jesus. So if we could just find out who we are as a people that proclaim Christianity, I think that we could get started back on the right track. That's all.
Others, what do you want? I try to rush you. Let's get one on the other side. There's a couple over here.
I grew up in church. I'm a PK. I wear that title proudly. I remember growing up in church, the one of the most common things that you would see is people coming to the altar, right? Or people testifying and having an ask. And as I got older and deeply embedded in movement, what I realized is that most people, they were asking for a material response, right? They needed money to bail their child out of jail. They needed a better school to help their child with developmental needs. They needed running water or a better neighborhood to live in. And the response to this was often pray, right, and come to church, when the true response is one of public policy, and that we should call on Jesus, but we also should call our mayor and our city council. But too often we make the spaces where people call to bring up their concerns apolitical. And when we bring politics into the space that is often apolitical, it gets hyper-conservative for folks who are closest to the issue. So my question is, how do we bridge that gap in these conversations where churches, I've only been in Black churches, are overly conservative in the midst of hyper-marginalization with people who need to be political in order to actually be about their Father's business, to actually improve the conditions of their community? How do we begin to have those conversations? And I also ask that because how do we begin to bring churches and movements closer when movements are led by women, movements are led by queer and trans people, movements are led by young people who have walked away from the church but have a faith in something higher than us, and we see Jesus as liberation. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, we see that as a faith-based comment. How do we begin to have those conversations where in that space that has truly allowed itself to become apolitical by choice, I think?
Great. So I'm going to ask that we get Jennifer's comment or response, and then we invite the panel to respond.
This is really related to what Kayla said, so I really appreciate her comment. I'm what Reverend Wallis would also call a formally. And, if this was the version of Jesus that I had met when I was 12 or 13, I might not be so. And so the only thing that I would add to what Kayla has said is that I hear this conversation sort of being very dependent on white churches' ability to sort of reconcile what they've always known, this white supremacist framing of Jesus, with all of this. And I think that the challenge that I see for many faith-based organizers is that the ability to do that is wholly dependent on white churches behaving differently. And what I hear people saying is that feels deeply necessary, that work that these congregations need to do to sort of come to this understanding. But I also hear them saying that feels deeply uninteresting and deeply not my job. It's not my job to make you sort of see this thing that is readily obvious for so many of us who are ready to roll up our sleeves and do the work. And so I would just ask sort of, in some ways, the onus for what Kayla is saying is on white congregations. And I'm wondering who's doing that work, who's leading that work when our Black faith leaders are busy doing the stuff.
Great. So 3 different items that could perhaps be responded to. How does the village come together to respond and raise wrap around children? How do we understand that village ethic? How do we see the intersection of faith and movement work? How do we make that come together? And how do we react and respond when much of this is dependent upon the white church that is being so kind of critiqued, that if it was wanting to do this work, then maybe would have done it already. So invite our panelists to react, respond, help us with this.
Thanks for these wonderful and provocative musings. My confession is it's really beyond my pay grade. I mean, it really is. To the degree by which I really want to ask, now I'm not doing this, but so if it wasn't for the sake of time, here's what I would do. I would say, Kayla, Sister Kayla, is that your name? Please write out for us the vision of how to get it done, because you cannot frame a question that precisely and provocatively without having some sense of what the answer is. That's what I believe, right? So so I'm saying that to say part of what we do should be let the people lead.
Yeah.
So part of the cardinal sin in black faith spaces, and I'll say for a second why I center on black faith spaces outside of the fact that that's my primary point of entry through my experience, but we always feel like I'm the pastor, I got to lead. No, you the pastor, you have to empower your people to be the best people that they can be, which means sometimes sit down and shut up. But that's a difficult model for most black. I wonder if they teach that at Eden, like, right, you know, like the sit down, shut up pastoral model of leadership. Let's work on that syllabus, right? That one in the syllabus, right? So the other thing is our expectation, and then I want to come to my sister's piece about apolitical theology, which I don't believe exists. Our expectation, probably jaded by mainstreamed perceptions of who Jesus was, is, and is becoming, discourages us from gathering the faithful few, if you will, or the small number of people that we can gather, even if that's whipping up 6 votes in the Senate and just getting something on public record so that people can't lie about what did and didn't happen, or at least it would be more difficult for them to, or even if they lie, you could at least point to what the truth is, right? Right?
Because they're going to lie.
They're going to lie.
Because they're going to lie.
And part of the point that I'm pressing is this, like we feel like the way that the political infrastructure is currently, it hadn't always been that way. They organized. Unapologetically organized. You know, the Southern strategy is a thing, and it's not a new thing. I mean, these are people of faith, primarily white brothers and sisters, with black brothers and sisters trying to emulate what they saw white brothers and sisters doing, that cultivated an environment whereby now my sisters are saying, and many of our people who we labor with are saying, I didn't even know you existed. And bringing us the questions that they think are going to trump us, because it's like, well, I asked 60 other pastors this, and they said this. You're not saying that? You're a pastor, ain't you? Yes, I'm a pastor, and that's not what I'm saying. So we have to unapologetically organize, is what I'm saying. Even if that means you organize 4 people or 5 people. Because the myth that you are going to get the masses to do it and do it immediately. The truth does set us free, but the text doesn't say it sets you free immediately. Which means, as Angela Davis says, you got to keep fighting to protect, preserve, and promote what is true. And so our expectation is that we'll immediately do it. And so we succumb to this issue that it's possible to do theology that is apolitical. That's not possible. It's possible to do individual spiritual practice. But when you start talking about theology and religion, you're talking about something that's done in public, where 2 or 3 are gathered in God's name. God is in the midst, which means you have to negotiate some space, some resources, some ideologies. And so what is it? What I want to call it? The sin is us presuming that being apolitical is being more godly. No. What you are doing is adopting the political and theological posture of the empire. which is sustaining the empire. So if I would make a recommendation, it would be this. If we can find a way to highlight and promote those few and far between ministries that are doing that work, and it's just going to be from a proportionate standpoint, more black churches than white, but even in black churches, 13% of the black churches were involved in the civil rights movement. Let people stop lying, making you think it was all of them.
True.
And we know it's a small percentage now, because I'm telling you right now, if me, Reverend Tracy, Reverend Starsky, I see my brother Reverend Aaron Letcher, who just came in, if we went through our phones right now, we can list 50, because it might not even be 50, churches in the country doing the type of work that we're talking about. By the time we get to 16, we'd probably be like, right? But if we can highlight these as the models, if people would put their financial and fiscal resources, I know y'all scared to erect the black Jesus in your sanctuary, so send your money to the churches that do it. Send a tithe. No, don't. Take the flag out. I know, right. At least that's the place to start. All I'm saying is do something. But most of what we want to do is charity and not justice. So at least let your charity fund the justice work for the people who are doing that work on the ground. And then when people see that work highlighted, maybe, or at least they'll say, let me consider at least trying. Because I've seen it happen with Up to Vote 901 stuff. The same people say, no, I can't believe. I was the rabble-rousing agitator who was the Muslim several years ago because I was wearing dashikis. They just automatically make you Muslim. But now, some of my colleagues who wouldn't say white supremacy in public 6 years ago, or at least trying to say it now, even if they say it out of context, and getting custom-made dashikis.
Amen. I think it's important for us to lift up the fact that there's brilliance among us, and that brilliance, especially the brilliance that operates from the radical, queer, black feminist lens, which we need if we will survive our own anti-freedom struggle, because churches are moving against themselves. But when we see the brilliance of the radical, queer, black feminist lens, and we know that there is a plan among these leaders, why require them to give us their plan? That's on us. We pushed y'all out. The church pushed me out. You want my brilliance, you better pay for it. Yeah, Kayla has an answer. But we should never require movement leaders to tell us the whole answer to the question that they're presenting to us for our growth, for our maturity. So I will only answer the question in a parable, since I'm a reverend. In the 15th chapter of Luke, there's a family problem. There are two sons in a household. Baby boy says to his daddy, give me all that money that I didn't work for, but you have it and I deserve it. Older brother stays at home. Baby boy goes out, and the Bible tells us that he did some wild living. Y'all know this story. I don't know how many of you thought that when you heard about wild living that the baby brother was rabble-rousing and paying for hookers and hooking up and doing drugs. And I was raised to view this story as a story of the soul of a nation. The baby brother is white people of faith. And so to my older brothers in the room, people of color who have been in the church and done the extra homework, I want you to know that the baby boy has to come to himself. The Bible tells me that white folk gonna have to come to your senses on your own in your pigsty. Your pigsty might be a pulpit. Your pigsty might be a boardroom. Your pigsty might be a development fundraising phone call. I cannot assist you in coming to your senses in your pigsty. You left me at home to be in the field, to tend the flocks, and I'm waiting for you. And when white folks show back up to the Global South Church, which is mostly brown, and they want to feast with us again, why? Because the Bible says we have more than enough spiritually right here already. We have more than enough. So when the baby brother comes back from his wild living, selling everything in his body, and he's hungry, we're bitter, and we get to be. My encouragement to the formerlies, and even to myself, is that the Lord is cupping your face in their hands, and they're looking at you, and they're saying exactly what Daddy in the parable said to the older son. Everything I have is yours. Don't wait till the battle is over. Don't wait until that church welcomes you. Don't wait until somebody begs you for the strategy that you know you can do. Start right now. Live in your shout. And remember, that baby boy took half of the inheritance and squandered it. And my Bible says, y'all gonna have to come to yourselves.
So before we make our final transition, I'll offer Dr. Krause an opportunity to have our final word.
And for my white sisters and brothers who just heard this powerful proclamation and wonder where that leaves us.
Come on, Dad.
That's my dean.
I think that framing this as a conversation is helpful in a way, but I also think here in this place in St. Louis, my experience since Mike Brown was murdered and the Ferguson Freedom Movement rose up, led by Black queer women and poor people and young people. And I found myself as a theological educator, a white theological educator, summoned by the call of my former students, one of whom is Tracy Blackman, one of whom is Starsky Wilson, and many others, to join them as they began to respond as religious leaders to these cries of pain and suffering in our community. That for me was a redemptive moment, right? To wake up to myself in my pigsty and to follow the call of Jesus, to be in proximity to the suffering of God's people, that is what we are called to do and be. And so where it leaves us is, yes, having conversations, but also moving into spaces outside of our churches, outside of our homes, outside of our home communities, outside of our neighborhoods, outside of our villages, into spaces and following those people who are doing the reparative work. Pay attention. In this room today is a leader of mine who's been doing this work for a long time. I met her in the streets during Ferguson. Her name is Kathy Daniels, Mama Cat. She is right here. She busted out of her household and her profession as a pastry chef and culinary artist to feed young people who were protesting in Ferguson and create family and home in the streets, and to literally feed the movement every Sunday night, family dinner in the Andy Worm parking lot across from the Ferguson Police Department, and kept the movement going in many ways with that powerful act of insight about where repair work needed to happen. Without a pastor, without a church, with some chafing dishes and crock pots. And she has gathered a movement of people who work with her, who follow her in that work. And there are many other people at work in St. Louis in the same way. And so if you're wondering, where do I go? How do I go? Follow the people who are doing the reparative, redemptive work. And move into those spaces and join them, and maybe your church will come to. But the promise is you'll meet Jesus there.
I got to move. I want to invite you to help me do something, but I got to move now because you promised people at 11 o'clock.
Just a word to this. Albert Cleage in Detroit lifted up the shrine of the Black Madonna. It's all very controversial and all that. And Jackie Grant, who studied with Jim Cohn, came back to critique all those systems too. But here's the thing. Soren Kierkegaard once said, when everybody's a Christian in a country, nobody is. Nobody is. Here's the problem with the fake white Jesus. The fake white Jesus can't save anybody. So we're talking about not just what those churches ought to do, and we're talking about the salvation of white Christians is at stake. And the fake white Jesus, there is no reconciliation without truth.
That's right.
And the fake white Jesus isn't going to save anybody. Why are all of the white churches declining? All of them. Southern Baptist, Evangelical, because their young kids say, there's no Jesus here. There's no power here. This Jesus isn't changing anything. This Jesus is just a sociological white conservative. It's not Jesus. So what's at stake here is salvation. Salvation, if this is America's original sin, it requires repentance. And repentance doesn't mean feeling guilty or feeling bad or being sad. It says turn around. The word means in all our traditions, turn around and go in a whole new direction. The problem with the fake white Jesus, it really doesn't save anybody. So let's have a conversation, and it is structural. It is so structural. Structural not just in our economic system, education, it's structural in our theology. False, bad, heretical theology, which has to be overturned. See, that's why I think a conversation about Jesus, it might help with the election. I think it might, but it could actually save a few people.
So I'm glad y'all didn't clap that hard, because when you start clapping hard, people start walking out during the clapping. I don't want y'all to walk out here. I recognize it's 10:58. We promised you we'd be gone at 11 o'clock, so I want to ask Grace for another till 11:07. Is that all right? As I said before, we wouldn't be here. Part of what we honor today is that we opened up in September a grant opportunity, and there'll be opportunity for everybody to act here. So we're going to make an announcement, make a presentation, and then we're going to invite you to action, because we don't have conversation for conversation's sake. So we talked about in 1969 the work of Reverend Buck Jones. We talked about the mobilization of people who were impacted, people-centered policymaking. Talked about people in their community saying they had enough of these increases in their rent. The sign that you see on the screen is one of their signs that they made. When all our money goes for rent, our food money gets spent. A sign that, quite frankly, could be held up in Southwest Crossing in St. Louis today. A sign that could be held up about the conditions at Clinton Peabody just last year. To be clear, yes, this is a 50-year anniversary, but the work is absolutely still in front of us. And so, honoring the ministry of Dr. Buck Jones and this anniversary, at the same time, we were reading the paper in Clinton Peabody and seeing what was going on in Clinton Peabody, and some of our partners were already acting there. The folks from Generate Health who were working with moms there already to care for their children. One of our partners at Deaconess Foundation was there before the cameras, helped to call the politicians to finally get them to pay attention to people who were being impacted. And it was a calling back to ourselves At that moment, when we were reading the paper, at the same time in Florissant, Mrs. Ethel Jones was reading the paper. She confessed to me when we were together for lunch last week that she was reading the paper saying that if Buck was here, he'd be all over that. And she wondered whether she should be all over that and how, and whether she had the strength in this moment in life to be all over that. I was pleased to be able to share that the way the Spirit moves. There was work happening at the time to negotiate the power of the voices of those residents who were able to lift their voices and organize enough to get elected officials to pay attention, to get the property manager there, who shall remain nameless, at least today. If you Google it, you can find him. We'll leave him remain nameless today. To make $300,000 worth of repair to their living conditions. And then to put just a little bit of money, not enough to really do a whole lot, into sustaining and organizing them. And so one of our parents who was organized through our freedom schools was involved in the conversation about what was going to happen to that little piece of money. And this mom, who's concerned about this community, said, why don't you put that money over at Deaconess Foundation? Because they do some stuff with parents and their partners to help organize them. And we know it's not enough money to do a lot with the money, so it's got to be something that had its catalyzing effect to sustain the voices of the people. And so the Attorney General settled the suit with the St. Louis Housing Authority and with that property manager, provided some resources here. We added resources to that in order to create a $40,000 reward to support mobilizing activities with Clinton Peabody residents over the next 2 years in the name of Reverend Dr. Buck Jones. So we have something here. Staff, y'all gonna help me out for a second? Y'all have something? Whatever you got, give it to Reverend Blackman. I invite her to bring it up. In 2002, there was a celebration for the sacrifice and the service that Mrs. Ethel Jones gave to the Jennings School District. And on the day of that celebration, preparing for the dinner, Reverend Jones was having a little chest pain, such that he didn't make the dinner. And she went to the dinner, received the honor. And thoughtfulness, right? You can't care about macro stuff really in faith unless you care about little things. You care about people. And so he knew he couldn't make it, but he made an arrangement that for each year of her service to the children of North County and Jennings, there would be one rose, 25 roses presented to her there that night. She completed that dinner, rushed home, gave him a call. She said that the house was only about 3 minutes away. I think I made it in a minute. Connected with him, took him to the hospital, and later had to return home with those 25 roses, but not with him. So one of the things that I've said, and Tracy and I have talked about, is that we get to do ministry among and with people in this community in his spirit because of his witness and his legacy of mobilizing people to pay attention to people in East St. Louis, pay attention to people in North St. Louis because of the work that he did. And we recognize that he couldn't do that work without his remarkable partner in life. And so we wanted to honor Mrs. Ethel Jones today with these 25 roses.
Oh, thank you.
She said he'd be all over it. Deaconess Foundation became a grant maker in 1998 after a sale in 1997 of the Deaconess Incarnate Word Health System. The highest award we gave as a health system was the Spirit of Deaconess Award. That award was given in 1996. Last recipient to Reverend Buck Jones. So in ways we're coming back. And he's all over it because this award that is given today, out of deep respect and self-determination of the residents of Clinton Peabody, who informed this process of selection, is given to Action St. Louis. So I invite the representatives of Action to come on up. I'll tell you what they're going to do. I don't know why y'all standing over there. Y'all scared of me? I know you ain't scared of me.
You know, you just always stand behind the clergy.
As a result of this award, the Action St. Louis team will convene, train, and support the development of an action plan chosen by the residents of the Clinton Peabody to self-organize toward their own desired goals. Additionally, residents will participate in a People's Assembly, where tenants will form working groups to identify goals to be included in an action plan. And once the action plan is developed, Action St. Louis will provide research on the issues, implement organizing training, support ongoing tenant turnout and communications, and seek out partner organizations for social services for residents. Residents have already started brainstorming with Action and with Action staff on kickoff opportunities to launch the partnership in the coming weeks. We're excited that Buck Jones is all over it, and more excited that Kayla and Sarah are all over it.
Yeah.
And y'all are not off the hook. It's around night now, it's 11:07. So at 11:07, it's time for us to stop and you to start, so you got three choices. These are conversations about faith-inspired action, so we're going to give you some options to act. I invite you now. You already got out. Yes, thank you. Take pictures of this slide. I invite you to three opportunities to act. And I invite you to tweet, to share, whatever platform you use. I can only manage two at a time. And choose from one of these three options. Number one, organize a conversation. Outside, there are copies of Jim's book. You can get a copy of the book. You can also go to this website, on the Sojourners website, to get a copy of a discussion guide for different contexts. So, we want to have this conversation in community. We want to have this conversation between churches. We want to have this conversation in 2020 to transform. Continue this conversation today. You had something you wanted to say, you can get to say. Guess what? You can organize a whole group of people.
That's right.
And you can have that conversation. Number one, organize a conversation. What I want to see a few people who are willing to tweet and at us, at Deaconess. You got your stuff on the bottom, at us, get at us. When you tweet this, say, just for kids, hashtag just for kids, I will organize a conversation. And at Deaconess. All right, so tweet that. All right. Second group of people, just for kids, I will mobilize my congregation. There's an opportunity. Reverend Norma, as she noted, is going to be leading as the first woman who leads Gamaliel, Illinois. And Iowa, excuse me. And Iowa. Don't you miss Iowa. Don't miss that first caucus state. I'm just saying. We'll be mobilizing on January 12th, Sunday, January 12th at 8 o'clock in the morning. They're going to leave from East St. Louis, head to Iowa for the People's Caucus. United Congregations of Metro East is going to be mobilizing people. Just because you live on this side of the river don't mean you can't go with them on the other side. Lord knows a whole lot of people flooding to Iowa, transforming 2008 election. Y'all might want to go with them. So, just for kids, hashtag just for kids, I'll mobilize my congregation. Last thing, y'all saying that's kind of far off. Y'all need something to do now. Let the church say now. We know you needed something to do now. Just for kids, I will serve my neighbor. Critical question, who is my neighbor? You heard the story of our pastor, Mama Cat. She credentialed now. She got a doctorate of divinity from Eden Theological Seminary. Just like Dr. Buck Jones. Pop bangers, United Neighbors United Holiday Dinner is this Saturday at 5. You say, I got something to do this Saturday at 5. That's all right. On Wednesday, Mama Cat and the crew are starting to pack bags, prepare lunches, prepare the meals on this Wednesday. So, hashtag just for kids, I'm going to serve my neighbor. So these are your 3 options. Y'all ain't got y'all phones out. Y'all got y'all phones out all the time. And now you want to put them up. So choose. Who's got number 1? Get your phone out. Who's got number 2? Who's got number 3? All right. So I invite you to check these out. Information is here. Go to the last slide for those last 2. You got the flyer for Saturday on one side. You got the flyer for January on the other side. You also have some people who are willing to hold you accountable. Stand up, Reverend Patterson. If you want to go to the People's Caucus, you can see Reverend Patterson today. She's right here. If you want to help out with Neighbors United, you can see Mama Cat. She's right here. Mama Cat, go and stand up. Because these are conversations to make a community that is just for kids, that is equitable for kids. But this is not just conversation. We're glad that you joined us today. We look forward to being on Twitter. We look forward to seeing your tweets, holding you accountable. If we don't see enough, we're going to email you because we got all y'all email address. Thank y'all very much for coming out. Thank you for living the witness.